Okay, everyone, we're going live. Welcome participants to today's webinar, Cycling for Sustainable Cities, and welcome also to Hub Cycling's Go by Bike Week, which runs until Sunday, June 6th. My name is Kathy Acuna, and I'm the membership manager with Hub Cycling. This webinar is organized by Hub Cycling, and it's brought to you by its card-carrying members, as well as the City of Vancouver, City of Richmond, City of Burnaby, City of Coquitlam, City of Port Moody, Cadillac Fairview Pacific Center, and Van City. Hub Cycling, for those of you who aren't familiar, is Metro Vancouver's advocacy group for people on bikes, and our mission is to get more people cycling more often. And we achieve this through our advocacy work, education, events, and our research. And you can find more about Hub at bikehub.ca. And before we begin, we'd also like to take this time to acknowledge that I'm personally webcasting live from the traditional territories of the 3 local First Nations, the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh. And we also want to give a special shout out to our card-carrying members for making this programming possible. If you'd like to join Hub as a member, please go visit bikehub.ca/join. Just a few housekeeping rules before we begin. As you listen to the presentation, please use the chat function to ask the questions. We've given our speakers ample time at the end to answer them. And as a reminder, this meeting and all chat functions are being recorded, so please don't record them yourselves or photograph them. And don't share personal information or information in the chat. We also wanted to let you know that because of Go by Bike Week, we have an additional bonus for everybody who's calling in today. We'll be raffling off a chance to win a physio voucher to LES Health, and you must stay on the call until 1 p.m. to be eligible for this prize draw. And we'll be alerting the winners by the end of the week via email. And just a quick note on timings. Because our presenters, John and Ralph, have so much of great information to share with us today, they're going to be presenting their information until around 1 o'clock. And then they've kindly agreed to stay on for a question and answer session until 1:30. So we know that this is a bit longer than our usual Go by Bike Week webinars. So if you can't stay on for the Q&A, we totally understand. Please still pop your questions in the chat, and we will send a recording of this webinar, including the question and answer session at the end, to everybody who's registered, so that you can catch up on your own time if you can't stay on for the whole session. And then you can catch up on anything that you may have missed in your own time. So we have a great webinar for you today. We're pleased to bring you also a very short video. It's just a minute from one of our sponsors, Van City, who've continued to be incredibly supportive of our cycling community and of who are socially and economically and environmentally sustainable. So with that, here's just a word from our sponsor, one of our sponsors.
Department at Van City, Canada's largest community credit union. At Van City, we're committed to action. We're doers. And what we do is we use the tools of finance to build a clean and fair world, a world where no one gets left behind. We envision a resilient economy that works for everyone and puts equal weighting on people, our planet, and prosperity for all. With everything that we do, we strive to make this vision a reality. A key piece of achieving this vision is ensuring that people in our communities are empowered to live lighter and have the tools and opportunities to improve their physical and mental well-being. We believe that active transportation like cycling is an important activity that is not only good for people, but is also good for the planet. And to help get more people out on bikes, Van City has designed what we call our Planet-Wise Transportation Loan. This product offers preferred financing for low-carbon transportation solutions, including pedal bikes, e-bikes, electric scooters, and much more. Van City is proud to partner with Hub in advancing bike culture in our region. We hope you enjoy this webinar, and we can't wait to see you out in the bike lanes.
Great. Well, thanks again, Van City, for that message. And with that, I'd now like to turn it over
Hi,
to very...
my name is Krista Lowen, and I'm an associate.
Sorry about that. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to our very 2 distinguished panelists. Dr. John Pucher is Professor Emeritus of Urban Planning and Policy Development at Rutgers University in New Jersey. And Dr. Ralph Buehler is Professor and Chair of Urban Affairs and Planning at the School of Public and International Affairs at Virginia Tech. And we're so lucky to welcome both these panelists who've recently co-authored a book also titled Cycling for Sustainable Cities, which is available from MIT Press, and you can buy it on Amazon or request it from your local booksellers. So with that, Ralph and John, over to you.
Thank you very much. Both Ralph and I would like to thank Hub Cycling for inviting us to give this presentation. The timing is perfect because June is Bike Month in Canada, a country I love a lot, by the way. This week is Go by Bike Week in Metro Vancouver. And on top of all that, today, June 3rd, is the United Nations World Bicycle Day. So the stars are all lined up for us. Ralph and I would also like to thank each and every one of you for taking the time to participate in this webinar on cycling for sustainable cities. Now, just a few words about me, John Pucher. Almost all of my research over the past 4 decades has involved international comparisons of urban transport systems, policies, and travel behavior. And that helps explain the international focus and scope of the book. I've always felt that we can learn a lot from other countries about how to improve urban transportation here in North America, both the United States and, of course, in Canada, especially when it comes to public transit, walking, and, of course, cycling, the topic of this book. It was my 3 years on sabbatical as visiting professor at the University of Münster, Germany, where 40% of all trips are made by bike by every conceivable segment of society. And those 3 years in Münster inspired my love of cycling and motivated my cycling research of the past 25 years. Now over to Ralph.
Hello, thank you for joining from me as well. My name is Ralph Buehler. I'm professor and chair of urban affairs and planning at Virginia Tech. I study determinants of how people get around, if they walk, if they ride a bike, if they ride public transportation, or if they drive, and then what the outcome is of these decisions for the economy, the environment, and for equity. A lot of my work is international comparative, looking at countries and cities across the world to see what they can learn from each other and how we can make our transport system more sustainable. This already leads us to our book, which is an international collaboration of 40 experts from 5 continents in different areas, in planning and engineering and in geography and in public health. And we were lucky to bring them all together for the book. And the book, as you can see here, is titled Cycling for Sustainable Cities. And the main idea is to find out how to make city cycling safe and convenient for everyone. And looking at the title slide here, you can already see several of these measures that are needed to get people riding. These are different facilities, integration with public transportation. You'll also notice that we have different people riding, we have young people riding, we have older people riding, we have people riding of different races and ethnicities, and that's sort of the goal of the book. This is the cover of the book, and the picture here is one from Amsterdam, and this shows truly mass cycling. This is not a bicycling event. This is just everyday cycling there in the Netherlands. But you can also see here that it's men as well as women who are riding bikes, that they are riding regular bikes. Some people have special bikes, cargo bikes. And of course, you can also see that we have a green light there for the bicycle on the right hand side. In the following, I'll briefly take you through an overview of the book, very, very short, because we cannot cover everything in this presentation, and then we really dive into this talk. So the book starts with an introduction where John and I sort of set the framework with an international overview of cycling from various countries and cities and explore the topic of bicycling. This is then followed by chapters written by experts on specific topics of cycling, like cycling and public health, cycling and safety, a very important topic, bicycling infrastructure, and not just any infrastructure, but infrastructure for everyone, that everyone can cycle, bicycle parking, because bicycles are parked a lot. And then we have a chapter focusing on non-infrastructure programs and policies that help promote cycling, and a chapter that looks at evaluating cycling policies to help us decide which policies to implement, which policies to prioritize. The next 2 chapters are related to technology and bicycling, one on e-bikes and their growth in usage in Europe and North America, and the growth of bike sharing and the evolution of bike sharing. The next chapters focus on specific rider groups. The first is on women and cycling, followed by a chapter on children and bicycling, and then a chapter on older adults and cycling. This group of chapters is rounded out by a chapter focusing on social justice and cycling, which is also a theme that carries through the book. So we've asked all chapter authors to also look at social justice within their specific topic. After that, we have a couple of case study chapters, starting with country case studies, looking at cycling in China and India, the two largest countries in the world. Very important to look at those for bicycling. Then cycling in Latin America, and then followed by city case studies, first going with the mega cities, New York, London, and Paris, followed by the large, well-known European cycling cities, comparing Copenhagen and Amsterdam. And then we shift to two cities that didn't have a bicycling history or tradition, Portland, Oregon, and Sevilla, Spain. And we brought two authors there together to compare the development of cycling there. Next, we have a chapter on a very important topic, cycling advocacy, which is important in Europe, North America, and Australia. And then in the end, John and I come back and distill some conclusions from all of these chapters that we had before.
Given that we have sustainability, as the word sustainable in the title, it won't surprise anybody that we do believe, and we show in the book, that cycling is in fact an extraordinarily sustainable means of transportation, especially getting around cities. And there's three different perspectives on this. One, it's environmentally sustainable. So you have very little pollution, whether it's noise pollution, air pollution, water pollution, whatever, very little pollution, and also very little in the way of non-renewable resources being used. That's sort of the kind of aspect of sustainability that everyone sort of takes for granted, or where they think about sustainable transportation. But also cycling is a very socially sustainable means of transportation. It's financially affordable by just about everybody. It's physically possible by most people. And also it has, and this is considered sort of a social health benefit, a social aspect of sustainability, physical, mental, and social health benefits from the physical activity that you get from cycling. And one of the surprising things but I can't resist mentioning this in the health chapter, is the enormous mental and social health benefits of cycling, which usually are just not even mentioned. The other aspect of sustainability is economic. Of course, it's pretty obvious. There's low private as well as public costs of cycling. It doesn't cost much unless you buy a really super duper bike. Buy a bike for reasonably low cost, and also building bike lanes is much less expensive than building roads. It's also less expensive than building transit systems, although you need transit as well. And then you can have an economic benefit also because of the health benefits of cycling. The people are less likely to get sick. So you're saving in that way as well. So truly in all of these respects, environment, social, and also economic, cycling is a very sustainable mode of transportation. It's just about perfect. In fact, I would say cycling's divine. And this is a photograph I took. I couldn't resist this one. I took this photograph in the mid-1980s when I was a visiting professor in Münster, Germany. And this is how nuns get around. It really is. At least it was in the 1980s. This slide shows you the vast differences. You might wonder, well, if cycling is so divine, why is it that English-speaking countries only have about 1% to 2% of trips by bike, which is what you see on the left-hand part of that graph? The 1% for the United States purposes, 0.6 is for the trip to work. And also for Canada and Australia, they only have the trip to work there, so it's a 1.5%. But the point is, that's a lot less than when you see on the part of the graph. The sort of the usual suspect of the Netherlands is up there at 28%, and then you have Denmark at 14%. And I was sort of surprised myself when we started this research. And Japan is at 13%, and Tokyo actually is at 17%. So actually a lot of cycling there. Germany and these other, the main point here is there's a lot of variation among these countries, but in general, there's a big jump in levels of cycling once you get across the channel from the UK over to the EU. And let me see, I think that's the main thing here. You might think, well, some of those differences, or maybe you think all of the differences in cycling levels are due to differences in trip distance among the cities and countries. It is true that trips tend to be longer on average in the United States, and by that probably also in Canada, than they are in these European countries. But that's not really the main reason. And at 40% of all trips in urban areas in the United States are 2 miles or shorter. and those are certainly bikeable distances, 40% of all trips. And yet, what you see here is only about 1% overall of trips made by bike in the United States. What this particular graphic does is it controls for shares of bike trips for different distance categories. So what it shows is that for every trip distance category, levels of cycling are much, much, much higher in Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands than they are in the United States, and also compared to the UK. Sort of weird that there's that huge difference between the UK and the EU, but there is. So it's just not true that it's just the longer trip distance that's the cause of the lower cycling levels in the United States. I'm not saying it's not a contributing factor, but as you can see, even for longer trip distances, you have quite a substantial percentage of trips by bike in these European countries, Germany, Denmark, Netherlands in particular. And the good news here is, looking at some very large cities all around the world, that there's been a large increase in cycling, in the share of trips taken by bike. And what you see here is in that particular bracket of cities, those cities started out with very little, if any, of a cycling tradition. So from very, very low levels of cycling, including Portland, including Vienna, including everything you see there, London, New York, San Francisco, all started with a very low level. And then they increased 2 to 10-fold in some cases, the share of trips by bike. In Vancouver, went from 1.7% to 6.1%. That happens to be for the trip to work. So it's a percentage of workers getting to work by bike. And that's just because we used the Canadian census, and the latest one was 2016. What you see on the right-hand side is that there were also significant increases from even high levels of cycling in cities like Copenhagen, Amsterdam, the usual cities that you talk about, but also Munich, Berlin, did have a cycling history. They did. It wasn't Amsterdam or any of these like the Dutch cities, but it's certainly a cycling history, a cycling tradition. And even there, you have a doubling in cycling share of trips. In Berlin, you have a large increase in Munich, and then you have also considerable increases. Well, just look at Amsterdam. That's a big increase in Amsterdam. So the main point of this is there's been a lot of progress made. The percentage progress, obviously, is the largest in those cities that started out with the lowest of cycling. So you can see, in fact, Copenhagen, Amsterdam, and Munich, which have among the highest levels of cycling, are way off to the left. They had sort of the smallest percentage increase. And then you go to the right-hand side and you see cities such as Bogota, New York, Buenos Aires, Portland, have much, much higher increases, percentage increases in the levels of cycling. And for Vancouver, you'll see where you are. That's a little bit more than a 3.5-fold increase, plus 259% increase in the bike share of trips in Vancouver. So a lot of progress in Vancouver. Congratulations.
And we got a little bit of a glimpse of the potential of cycling during the COVID pandemic. This data here compares bike trips counted at counters in the year 2020 to the year 2019. If we're above that horizontal line here at 0, it means there's more cycling in 2020. If we're below, there's less cycling in 2020 compared to 2019. On the horizontal axis, you have the weeks of the year lined up, and then you see the different countries and how their cycling levels compared. Overall, we are very often above that 0 line because we had net increases in cycling, but there's definitely variability. The biggest dips we see here around weeks 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. And these are the weeks when we had lockdowns in those countries. So very often people were confined to their homes in very strict lockdowns. They were not even allowed to leave their home without having a specific piece of paper saying where they are going and why they are going. And all trips, but cycling also dropped during these severe lockdowns. And then it sort of skyrocketed or jumped up again once these lockdowns were lifted. Looking at across data for these various countries, we saw increases in volumes and the percentage of trips made by bike, in particular because even if cycling held steady in a place, the other trips on public transport and by driving dropped so much that the share of trips by bike actually increased. But as you already saw, there was much variation by month, but also by time of day, by location, and by trip purpose. Specifically, we found strong increases in cycling for exercise, recreation, getting outdoors, and relief from stress. So people wanted to be outside during the COVID pandemic. We also saw big increases in afternoon and early evening in terms of cycling, and even larger increases on weekends in weekend cycling. When we look at the facilities, we saw the largest of those increases on off-road recreational paths. On the other side, we saw decreases in morning peak hour cycling. So these are the people who are now working at home or no longer going to school because they're going to school from home. And we see that in the data, they are missing. So there's a decrease in morning cycling. We also saw overall a decrease in utilitarian cycling, mainly because people were not going to work or to school or to university anymore. And of course, as we already saw, we had decreases during the lockdowns, and many studies show once these lockdowns were lifted, we had increases in cycling after that.
May I just make one comment, Ralph? Could you go back to the earlier slide? That these findings are based on many different studies, and they looked at literally hundreds of different cities and many different kinds of locations within each of those cities. So it's a really quite extensive base of data from many different studies.
And what many cities did reacting to this desire for more people riding bikes is building more bike infrastructure or changing city streets for cyclists. This is an example that's a permanent example from the Rue de Rivoli in Paris. That is sort of a bicycle street. Now you can see on the left, there's a bus lane, but overall this is a former car street that's now a bicycle street in the center of Paris. A little bit closer to you, Montreal, on the other side of Canada, they installed 68 kilometers of new or improved cycling facilities in 2020. And you see that they installed them at a very high quality. They installed protected bike lanes, and they're so safe and feel so safe that entire families are out riding on these facilities. These are some examples from the US, mainly from Cambridge and the Boston area. There were closed streets across the country and across the world that were given to pedestrians and cyclists. There were shared streets in neighborhoods where there was only local traffic allowed, motorized traffic, to go into those neighborhood streets, and bicyclists, pedestrians, joggers, inline skaters could use the roadway space. And of course, we had reconfiguration of roadway space for outdoor dining, these so-called parklets, outdoor eating. And in this case, we see up here, they changed this street to have the outdoor eating, had a one-way traffic lane for motorized cars, and then bikes going in this direction. And on the other side of the left of the yellow color here, a contra flow bike lane in this one-way street for motorized traffic. This shows you an example from the Boston area, from Boylston Street. This is Boylston Street before July 2020. During the COVID pandemic, they put in a pop-up bike lane, just putting in these bollards or these cones, and it was very successful, and cyclists really took to this street. And in response then, the city has now made this a permanent cycle track in the city, and this happened in many places across the world. We have one example here from Beach Avenue in Vancouver that was very popular, reached over 10,000 cyclists on several days, and was now converted into a not fully permanent, but in a protected bike lane with concrete curbs, and remains one of the busiest cycling routes. And you can also up here see our advertisement here for Hub Cycling if you look closely.
Well, Latin America is a very big, very important part of the world. 100 people living there and studying. It's very interesting. So we have an entire chapter, Latin America. There are no national travel surveys. There's virtually no national transportation information available for Latin. But there's information available on specific cities. And in fact, the colleagues, the three of them, all from Bogota, Colombia, who wrote that chapter, sort of organized this data set over a long period of years. And what you see here is that among Latin American cities, there's just huge variation in the percentage of trips by bike. So you have sort of the city you hear the most about is Bogota, Colombia, at almost 7% of trips by bike. Even more than that is Guadalajara, Mexico, at 8.3%. And then you go all the way down the scale, and these are big cities, Quito and Lima. You have virtually zero, 0.3%, and even less in cities like Valparaiso and so forth. But that's a ratio. I don't think you can calculate the ratio. It's so great, but the huge variation in cycling in Latin American cities. One thing I'll just emphasize: bicycling in Latin America is almost entirely utilitarian. There is some recreational cycling, but it's mainly on a daily basis. And here we also have a chapter on, because they have even more people than Latin America. Each of them about 1.4, 1.5 billion population, and incredibly large mega cities, 20, 30 million residents. Well, unfortunately, there's some bad news here, and that is that the share of trips made by bike in all of these Chinese cities and in China in general has really fallen sharply. And in fact, it's fallen more sharply than this graph even shows. And the reason is in that last year, it's different for each of these cities because they're based on city travel surveys that each city undertakes, and that's for different years. But in many cities, it includes e-bikes, and you might think, well, that's fine. But unfortunately, many of these e-bikes, and they're classified as e-bikes in China, are in fact electric scooters, meaning sit-down scooters with no pedals at all, and yet they're classified as e-bikes. So, and for some, it's not the case for all of these cities. It's not the case for Beijing, but as you can see in Shanghai, they include, for example, these pedalless e-bikes in the figure. So anyway, the whole point is a very unfortunate decline in the percentage of trips by bike in China. Why? Well, for one thing, a huge increase in per capita income over the past few decades, leading to an increase in car ownership, a massive investment on part of all of these cities and the government overall in China in new roadway infrastructure, massive new roadway infrastructure. So obviously you're getting big increases in car use, encouraging more people to use their car, and the cars being more affordable because of the increased incomes. The other is cities are spreading out. The cities are getting bigger and bigger with longer and longer average trip distances. And that means it's less and less feasible to cover the same percentage of trips by bike as used to be the case. The other reason for this decline in bicycling is the massive, truly massive investment in improved public transportation, especially metro systems. And I'm all for public transportation, but I'm just wanting to explain that is another reason why you have a lot of mode shift from cycling to metro systems and bus rapid transit and other kinds of public transportation as well, at fairly low fares. And as a result, it used to be that everyone in Chinese cities cycled. I mean, there really wasn't as much inequality, and men as well as women still cycle. Actually, there's not really a gender gap in China when it comes to cycling, but these are almost entirely utilitarian trips, work trips for the most part, but they're utilitarian trips, and they're now made much more often by lower income groups, whereas it used to be all groups cycled before. So it's sort of especially the central government of China has issued a directive that cities in China should try to turn around this falling trend of bicycling, and has directed for much more investment in advanced cycling infrastructure. But it's going to take a while to turn around the falling trend that we've seen. India, another really big and very important country, a roughly 20% overall share of trips by bike. And that's a lot. I mean, than you have actually in Denmark. So we're talking about a lot of cycling. I mean, India and China together certainly have more cyclists than the rest of the world combined. What this slide shows is that there's huge variation. Even these are all, they're ordered from left to right. Well, the largest city, Mumbai, is on the left, but Delhi and Kolkata, those three cities, Mumbai, Delhi, and Kolkata, are roughly the same size. They're all mega cities. They're huge. And yet big variations in the levels of cycling. 23% of trips in Kolkata, 11% in Delhi, 2% in Mumbai. Why in the world this difference? Well, one of the reasons is that Kolkata has lousy public transit, And so you're more likely to be dependent on the bicycle, and it's a better alternative. Mumbai has the best public transportation in India, and so it has more, cycling has more competition in that respect. The other issue is Kolkata also has much lower per capita incomes than Mumbai, which is the financial capital of India. That's not to say there are no low-income areas in Mumbai, but it's just the average income is indeed Kolkata than it is. And the street network, as it turned out, in Kolkata is also an important reason, as my Indian colleagues pointed out to me, and that it's more of a finely structured street pattern in Kolkata, which makes cycling more feasible. Mumbai is sort of like on a peninsula with very long distances to get to the residential areas where many people live. So, but cycling has been much steadier, actually, in the levels of cycling, much steadier in India than they have been in China. The reason, well, maybe it's not a good reason, but per capita income, although it's been increasing in India, the percentage of the population that is still in poverty is very large, and it's low-income people primarily in India who are cycling. Oh, the one last thing, I'm sorry, go backward. And that is there's a huge gender gap in India when it comes to cycling. There's no gender gap at all for cycling in China. In India, women, there's a stigma for women riding bikes in India. And also, they're more likely to be the subjects of verbal harassment and even physical sexual harassment. And many women are just afraid to ride the bikes for that reason. So there's a big gender.
If we want to promote bicycling, we have to make cycling feasible for everyone. And this slide shows that we can cycle at all ages. You can cycle from a very young age all into an older age, even if you may need a special bicycle, as we see the kids there with their little tricycles, but we also see adults with bicycles with 3 wheels that you can carry some cargo and give you more stability. We see utilitarian trips, but we also see people going out just for a ride. And cycling varies by age group across the countries. And for all the countries you see here, the share of trips made by bike is highest for those that are not at driving age yet. Once you are at driving age, the cycling share of trips drops. But yet again, there's a big difference between the US and the UK and the other countries here. In the US and the UK, cycling declines as people age and accounts for less than 1% of trips by people 70 years or older. And we look at the other countries, we again see this drop once you reach driving age, but then cycling doesn't really decline that much and stays relatively high. If we look at the oldest age group here, the 70 plus, we see that between 10 and 23% of trips by the 70 plus year olds are made by bike. In the Netherlands, here it's almost one fourth of all the trips by the 70 plus year olds are made by bike. So you can truly cycle still cycle at older age. Another big imbalance, and John alluded to that already, is between the men and women. In Australia, the UK, the US, and Canada, only between 1/4 and 1/3 of all bike trips are made by women. But in the other countries we see here, the split is about half and half, even a higher share of women making bike trips in Denmark, the Netherlands, and Japan. So a big difference in by men and women in making the bike trips. And these are pictures of women riding bikes in Denmark and the Netherlands. As we saw, over half of bike trips are made by women. We have a special chapter in the book on the rise of e-bikes. This graph just shows you the sales of e-bikes, even pre-COVID-19 pandemic. During the pandemic, e-bike sales grew even more. We see strong growth here in Germany, the Netherlands, but also the UK, France, Italy, and the US. And that's a trend that's only set to continue. Most of the bikes sold in the countries we see here are so-called pedelecs. So these are electric bikes where you only get electric support when you pedal. So they're quite different from what John described about these electric scooter bikes in Chinese cities. They exist as well, but the majority of the bikes here are pedelecs. So you get some physical exercise, and when you do that, you get some electric support.
It's absolutely crucial to make cycling safe, because that is the #1 reason everyone gives for not cycling. Especially women, when you ask, there have been both when you ask the very surveys where they ask women what's the most important factor in getting you on a bike, and safety is almost always number one, but that's usually number one for everybody. It does turn out, as surveys show, that the older adults tend to be more sensitive to cycling. And I'm one of those, by the way. I'm also so I have two reasons, I suppose, to be especially concerned about cycling safety. But there are many risk-averse people, and parents are certainly in the United States rather hesitant to let their kids cycle because they're of the safety issue as well. So it's really important to make cycling safe, to make it safe in fact, and also to convey that it's being made safer, and to make it low stress at the same time. But it's really crucial to make cycling safe and give that people safe, that safe feeling. I think that the much greater safety of cycling in the Netherlands, Denmark, and Germany is certainly one of the main reasons that you have high levels of cycling there. As we see in the next slide, unfortunately, this shows how bad the United States is and how good the Netherlands is in both regions. It can levels of cycling with cyclist fatalities per 100 million kilometers cycled, so the rate of cyclist fatalities per amount of cycling. And you can see there's a very strong relationship here. The higher the level of cycling, the greater the safety. The lower the level of cycling, the greater the danger that the cyclists face. And then all of these other cities. Now, in terms, there's this relationship that the fact that with more cycling, you get safer cycling, doesn't automatically have a relationship. And this is known as safety in numbers. That as you get more cyclists on the street, they become more visible, and visibility is absolutely crucial to safety of any mode of transportation. It also, as you have many more and more cyclists on the road, there's more public support and political support for better cycling facilities. So there's all sorts of reasons why more cycling would lead to safer cycling. And then the reverse is also true. As you get safer cycling, that also then encourages more cycling, because as the previous slide indicated, cycling safety is a crucial factor in getting people on bikes. That's especially true for women and older adults and anyone who's risk averse. Well, we've been making some progress, except for the United States. Well, a little progress, and then we reversed it. But for all of these, for 4 countries, for the UK, Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands, you have dramatic improvements in cycling safety. This is fatality rates again per 100 million kilometers cycled, and you can see in the UK it's about a third the rate that it was in the first period. You have half of the rate, so they get basically say twice as safe in Germany, more than twice as safe in Denmark, and maybe 60–70% safer in the Netherlands. So getting definitely continuously safer and safer in these 4 countries, these European countries. By comparison, in the United States, it did get somewhat safer during the first 2 time periods, and then shot up to 6 in the most recent time period. And you might wonder, well, why in the world did that happen? This is not a statistical fluke. Every single study that's examined this shows the same thing, that cycling has become more dangerous, and there's actually traffic safety has deteriorated in the United States overall, even for motorists, the passengers in motor vehicles, and also for pedestrians, of course. Big problem. Why? Number one, increase over this period, these last 2 periods in the United States, increase in vehicle miles traveled. Second reason, a huge increase in the percentage of personal vehicles that are light trucks, either SUVs, minivans, or pickup trucks. And when I say pickup trucks, I mean mega pickup trucks that I can hear actually from my neighbor next door at every time of day and night. But they're the larger fronts to the cars, larger surfaces overall, higher. There's a number of studies that look exactly at this issue of what is the impact of larger vehicles on walking and cycling safety, and they all come to the same conclusion: they have made it much more dangerous. There's also the issue of distracted driving, and to some extent, I mean, there is some amount of distracted cycling and distracted walking, but the key issue, the more dangerous one, is distracted driving. where people are texting while they're driving or just not paying attention. They're looking at their cell phone, all sorts of other things. The other issue is alcoholism. In Britain, it's called drink driving. We call it drunk driving in the United States. But the rate of drunk driving in the United States is much, much higher than it is in the UK or these the 3 EU countries. Can't remember this. There's a number of surveys we looked at, and all of them showed that instances where there were crashes, that drunk driving was a much higher percentage of the causes than was the case in any of these other European countries. So overall, as you can see, the Netherlands, Denmark, Germany doing much better, but the UK also progress, and we just need to. It's just a very unfortunate trend. It's really tragic. It's that we have so many lives lost because of this. Well, there's a chapter also on New York, Paris, and London. I was one of the co-authors on this. I did New York, and then we had a British colleague did London, and a French colleague did Paris. And the good news here is big increases in, at least relatively, big increases in the share of trips by bike. The biggest increase was in Paris, like a 12-fold increase. It started from the lowest level, 0.4%, and now it's the highest at 5.0%. And it's no wonder undertaking measures such as you saw there in Rue Rivoli, but many, many, many others long before that. In London, you have a doubling. In New York City, you have a little bit more than a tripling, up 3.5 times. So the good news that even in these mega cities that had been very bicycling unfriendly way back in the late 1990 even, and now they've just done a lot to make them better infrastructure and all sorts of other facilities. The result is safer and safer cycling in all 3 of these cities dramatically. And in this particular case, we were able to include both fatality rates, but also serious injury rates. And serious injury rates here, the way we looked at the statistics, we define this requiring overnight hospitalizations. That's the way that we standardized it among the different cities and countries as well. And you can see, though, in every single city, there's been a lot of progress being made. The most progress being made in Paris, and going from 19 to 3 and from 7 to 4. I mean, that's a huge improvement in cycling safety. Big improvement in London as well, going from 48 to 19, or looking at fatalities, 19 down. And this is all standardized to the amount of cycling. And improvement in New York, but overall, you can say New York is the least safe of these 3 cities. It's the least safe. Paris is the safest. London's in the middle, but all 3 have been making progress. That's the good news. And okay. And this is one of the ways that these 3 megacities have been encouraging more cycling and making it safer. And that is introducing massive networks of protected bike lanes. It's now, I would say, just the #1 strategy in each of these 3 cities. It's a major strategy at any rate. And I don't need to tell you which one is London and which one is Paris. The one on the upper left is New York City. But it's a very typical view, actually, of Manhattan, probably more typical than the views you have of London and Paris. This is looking south on 8th Avenue in Manhattan, and you can see a special bike light. So you not only have along the right-of-way, sort of between intersections, you have protected bike infrastructure, but you also have at intersections, you have turn restrictions for cars, you have special light signals that give an advanced green light to the cyclists. And all of this has made cycling much, much safer in these cities. So that's been really an important part of the policy, more cycling and safer cycling.
So how do we encourage more cycling while improving the safety? In the following slides, we'll focus on the first 2 bullets that are displayed here on better cycling facilities. John already showed some, and traffic calming of residential neighborhoods. But you also need mixed-use zoning and improved urban design to keep trip distances short enough, and also to make the streetscape safer for cyclists. You have to have integration with public transportation to allow for longer trip distances, or to allow cyclists that have a mechanical failure or something to switch modes. We need, importantly, restrictions on motor vehicle use, in particular speed, and we'll talk about that. Improved traffic education for motorists, but also for cyclists. Traffic regulations and enforcement of the regulations. For example, just this morning, I biked with my kids to school, and there was a big truck parked in the bike lane, which is a problem. One of the kids jumped onto the sidewalk immediately, afraid to go out in the street. So enforcement of regulations is important. And then special events and promotional campaigns. This graph here shows you for about 20 cities in Europe, North America, but also Australia and Latin America, how they expanded the mileage or the kilometers of their cycling facilities over the time period stated there. And it shows the associated growth in bicycling. So all cities that expanded their bike networks saw increased cycling. There's a lot of variability here depending on if the city had a bike network first and expanded a little bit, or if they started from scratch, etc. But what's important is in all of the cities, we saw declining fatality and severe injury rates relative to the cycling levels. So all of these cities have achieved safer cycling compared to the cycling levels. In the United States, we also have an increase in these protected bike lanes, also called cycle tracks. This shows you data from People for Bikes from 2006 to 2018, about a 15-fold increase. And we just recently got newer data, and the trend, the growth continues, and it's getting even more. This is what these facilities look like. On the upper left, we have Copenhagen in Denmark. If you look right here in the center, you see what the facility looks like along the roadways. You have a curb that separates the cyclists from the motorized traffic. You have another curb separating them from the pedestrians. And then through the intersections, they are carried on this bright blue color, sort of alerting drivers to the presence of cyclists. On the upper right, we have an example from Bogota in Colombia, where they are separating this two-way cycle track with these caps. They are called these yellow things that don't allow cars to drive easily into the cycle track. Montreal, you may all be familiar with that, is in North America, the city that has had the longest history of having a network of these cycle tracks. There, they are separating cyclists from motorized traffic with these concrete curbs. On the lower right is an example from Seville in Spain, where they built a fence separating motorized traffic from the cycle track. These are some other examples, this time from Australia, Sydney and Brisbane. You see in the lower left and the upper right similar designs as I showed before. It's the cycle track separated either by a curb or here even with planters and greenery from motorized traffic. What's also very important for cycling is in the upper left are bridges and connectors, because often without a bridge that accommodates cyclists, you cannot cross rivers, you cannot cross highways. And as you can see here in red, John is cycling on that bridge, so he approves of cycling on that bridge. And an innovation in bikeway infrastructure, or stitching together bikeway infrastructure, are so-called bicycle expressways. Various countries are experimenting with them. In general, they are bikeways that stretch into the hinterlands of cities. They can also go through cities. And the main characteristics are that they are separated from pedestrians, as we see here on the upper left, and that they do not cross roadway intersections at grade, which means you either have a bridge or you have a tunnel, but you're never crossing where motorized traffic is also crossing. This A, speeds up bicycling because you don't have to stop at a traffic light, and B, makes it much safer because this danger of that intersection is taken out. In Freiburg, on the upper left here, you see this sign FR1. They have taken the blue color, which is in Germany typically the color for the Autobahn, which is a big highway where you can drive in many stretches as fast as you like. And they're sort of using the same symbol, but they're using it for bicycles, indicating this is a bicycle expressway. We have other examples here from Germany on the right-hand side, and then here on the left, or in the center, we have an example from Beijing in China. And we have this example not only because it's a nice facility, but because it's elevated. So they have built elevated bicycle expressways to facilitate cycling sort of above the city, but away from motorized traffic. And this is part of the campaign that John mentioned before to bring back cycling and attract more people again to riding bikes. We have some of these facilities here in North America. Just 3 examples. On the left side, the Cherry Creek Trail in Denver, which is shared often with pedestrians, but also has stretches where pedestrians and cyclists are separated. The upper right-hand side, the Midtown Greenway in Minneapolis, where pedestrians are walking to the right of this white line and cyclists are to the left. And then the Minuteman Trail in Boston, where cyclists and pedestrians are sharing the space. This map shows you a grown bike network. It shows you the bike paths and lanes in Amsterdam. It's a truly connected network. All the lines in red are bikeways that are separated from motorized traffic. If you look very closely, there are some orange stretches in there. These are their plans of how they want to extend the network. And then, of course, on top of that, you have all of these neighborhood streets inside of the blocks where car traffic speeds are very low and cyclists can share the roadway with cars. So this is a bikeway network of a large city. And keep in mind that Amsterdam is not the #1 cycling city in the Netherlands. Actually, many Dutch people will say that Amsterdam is not good at all because there's so many other cities that have done even more for cycling. Many cities are following Amsterdam's example in building their bikeway networks, and we've brought you 2 examples here. On the upper part of the screen, we have Portland, Oregon, and you see there in this map in black, their bikeway network. It starts in 1990, and then you will see in the back the colors changing, and the more the colors get yellow and red, the higher the bike commute level is for that specific area. On the lower side of the screen, we have Sevilla in Spain, and there you see their bikeway network in green, and we are starting in the year 2005. Advancing for 10 years up in Portland, we see how much the bikeway network has grown. We also see how in the center of the city, the bike commute share has really gone up. And then really remarkable, at the bottom of the screen in Sevilla, how in only 3 years, they have really built a cycle track network very, very quickly. And then up to the last, another 4 years in Portland, again, the bikeway network has grown and cycling has grown a lot. And then here another 10 years at the bottom in Sevilla, and the bikeway network has gotten denser and denser. In many cities now, the focus is shifting from building bikeways along the links of the network, it's how we like to call it, along the roadways, to intersections, how to accommodate cyclists safely at intersections. This shows you a Dutch import to Salt Lake City. It's a Dutch-style protected intersection. I'll explain briefly how it works. The main element here are these so-called safety islands that we marked here. And if you have a motor vehicle that starts at a traffic light over here and wants to make a right-hand turn, because the turning radius is changed here, they have to make a relatively slow turn. And if they meet a cyclist that starts back here at this spot, if there would be a collision, it would likely be at lower speed, or it wouldn't happen at all, because cyclists and motorists are slow and have time enough to see each other to either swerve or to stop. Also, the safety island makes the motorist go out into the intersection and increases the likelihood for them to see the cyclist. The safety islands also shorten the distance the cyclist is actually in the roadway or could be hit by a motorized vehicle. And then once the cyclist is on the other side, they can start queuing here for a green light to make a left turn, or they can continue going straight.
Traffic calming of residential neighborhoods in particular is crucial, I think, to increasing cycling and improving cycling safety. Normally, in most European cities, the standard is 30 kilometers an hour, and there's a reason for that. That's the speed limit for motor vehicles. That's because when speed limits of motor vehicles exceed 30 kilometers an hour, which is about 20 miles an hour, the likelihood that a pedestrian or a cyclist would be killed in a crash with a motor vehicle increases exponentially. And so it's a very crucial speed limit there, 30 per hour. And you can see it really then goes up 35 miles an hour. And that's a standard speed for residential streets in much of the United States. That becomes almost certainly a fatal crash for the pedestrian or the cyclist. So you really need to slow down motor vehicles. And one way to do that is, in fact, to introduce traffic calming measures of various kinds. First of all, you can, of course, impose a law, a speed limit of 30 kilometers per hour, or the equivalent about 20 miles per hour. But also, I don't trust motorists. I'm sorry, I don't want to offend those of you who like driving cars, but I don't trust motorists, especially when I'm on a bike or when I'm walking. And I think it's essential to have some physical measures that force cars to slow down. Will I'll show you some examples of these, but you're familiar with them probably to some extent. Raised intersections and crosswalks, zigzag routing, road narrowing is absolutely crucial. Every study shows the narrower the road, the slower cars go, period. Speed humps, speed bumps, and then Ralph's going to do something really weird later, a speed lump, it's called. Mid-block closures, artificial dead ends, bulb outs, and so forth. So let's look at some examples. So this is a very typical kind of traffic calming in German and Dutch and Austrian and Swiss cities. Very, very, very common. In this particular case, the technique used is narrowing of the entrance to each end of the street. It's also, there is a posted a 30km/h speed limit. And the other important thing is this, it's not just an isolated street, which sometimes you'll get in sort of American cities. These are entire areas of the city that are traffic calmed. So you didn't get motorists using streets that aren't traffic calmed instead of streets that are traffic calmed. It's area wide. And then there's similar speed limits, by the way, and in terms of the arterials as well in these European cities. Here are some examples again from sort of closer by, across the continent, but anyway, Montreal and Quebec City. And you'll see this is called diverters, but it's almost like basically it's almost the same thing as the next one, it's an artificial dead end. But these are diverters, they went through traffic coming through residential neighborhoods. And that's really important. This idea of reducing car speeds in residential neighborhoods and eliminating through traffic is crucial to getting people to bike and also to walk, by the way, in residential neighborhoods. And that's where most bike trips and most walk trips originate at any rate. So even if there's great cycling infrastructure materials, you got to have safe cycling conditions. That doesn't necessarily require bike lanes, but you have safe cycling conditions. That means reducing the speed like this and preventing the through traffic. The next slide shows you a slightly different version of this. It's also a diverter. It's an artificial dead end, I would call it. I lived in Australia 2005, 2006 for over a year, and all over the neighborhoods in Sydney, and they weren't just automatically there. They were installed almost again and again because there had been a crash where a pedestrian or a cyclist had been seriously injured or killed. And so these neighborhoods, it was really a grassroots revolt saying, we do not want through traffic in our neighborhoods. We want to reduce car speeds. So anyway, this is another example of a kind of a traffic calming measure. And this is one that we found for Chicago. They have a number of now, both in Portland and Vancouver and many cities now throughout North America, cities are building greenways, which are composed of different kinds of cycling facilities. It may be a bike lane, it may just be a traffic calm street. Various kinds of conditions can apply. Here in this slide, you see there's a contraflow bike lane for cyclists, the ones cycling toward us, and then you have a shared bike lane and a shared lane for cyclists and for motorists going in the other direction. But it's really sort of interesting. The street is one way for cars and it's two way for cyclists. And I mentioned before the kind of sort of typical traffic calming you have in, say, German or Dutch cities. In many, many cases, a high percentage of those, you have two-way cycling for two-way traffic for cyclists and only one-way traffic for cars. And when they did this, and some have to sign it, but they signed it, but they found is there was no increase in cyclist injuries or fatalities as a result of allowing two-way bike traffic on two-way bike traffic on a one-way street for cars. So anyway, this is the Glenwood Greenway in Chicago, and it provided a really good parallel alternative to a busier street that was much more dangerous. This is I think this is wonderful. This is not a very sort of European looking slide, but this is a new, in fact, I took this photograph. I was cycling with a friend who's there. And this is called, it's a home zone in German, it's called the Play Street, Spielstraße. And you can see the sign that everyone is equally entitled to use the street. Cyclists, pedestrians, kids playing, and cars as well. But the cars really have the burden on them to be sure that they are not endangering the non-motorized users. And that is really, but the law also states very clearly in Germany and Belgium and many European countries, if you as a motorist hit a cyclist or a pedestrian, it is assumed to be the fault and the responsibility of the motorist, because cyclists and pedestrians are seen to be more vulnerable than motorists. So this is a very frequent, this is a new development, I mean, fairly modern, and yet this is a very, there's no infrastructure, by the way, if you look at this. I mean, there's the street, but there's no special bike lane. There's not even a sidewalk. So it really is a very shared space indeed. Next. Oh, Ralph has to say something special about this one.
So this is a way how to accommodate cyclists in traffic calming measures. This could be a speed hump where cyclists and motorists have to go up and down, so are vertically deflected. But with these speed lumps, you can achieve a bike lane that sort of goes straight and allows the cyclists to keep their speed while it slows down motorists. This particular bike lane is, the speed lump was installed here to the right, but there was no speed lump here on the left. And what happened, in spite of the line here, motorists would drive around the speed lump and would go into the bike lane. So they had to introduce this speed lump here on the left hand side. And as I had said before, I cycle with my kids to school. This is one of the pictures on their route. But the speed lumps are a way to accommodate cycling with traffic calming measures. Now, getting closer to the end of the presentation, bike transit integration and bike parking are also very important. First, integrating cycling with transit can have two dimensions, essentially. One is on the upper right and the lower left, you know that from Vancouver, allowing cyclists to take their bikes onto vehicles, either on a bus, on a rack, or even onto vehicles. Often taking bikes on vehicles is restricted to off-peak hours or certain cars or certain doors of cars. The second element of bike transit integration is parking your bicycle at the train station. On the upper left here, we have Washington, D.C.'s bike parking garage for about 130 bikes at Union Station. In the center, we have one in Freiburg, Germany, and on the right, we have Groningen in the Netherlands. And in these facilities, bicycles are protected from the weather. And in the case of DC and Freiburg, they're also protected from vandalism or theft. The one here in Groningen is more open for people to walk up. So it's a bikes are protected. But there's also more common bike parking along streets. We see a bike corral here in Portland, where car parking was taken out for 2 cars and 20 bike parking spots were installed. And you can also have bike parking like we see here in Nagoya in Japan, using machines or using robots, where you sort of enter your bicycle into the machine. The machine either goes down or goes up, depending on how the storage works, parks your bike. You can retrieve your bike with a code, and it just takes a minute to get your bike out again. Again, it's protected from theft, vandalism, and from the weather. There are many other measures you can implement to promote bicycling that we haven't focused on. One of them, for example, is ciclovías. This is the closure of roadways for motorized traffic, and you only allow pedestrians, cyclists, inline skaters, etc., to use that roadway for certain hours, for a day, for a weekend, or for a week, giving people the sense of what this place could be like if we wouldn't use it for moving motorized vehicles or storing motorized vehicles, parking them. Bike sharing has been very successful in attracting new riders to bicycling. In particular, cyclists who do not want to worry about maintenance of their bikes. They don't want to worry about theft of their bikes, because once you lock the bike or you dock it, it's not your problem anymore. And people who have a small space or live up many stairs, who don't want to carry their bike up into their apartment, they can just use the bike share and have the bike outside and don't have to worry about it. Employers and other programs exist to entice people to ride or to ride to work. There's a bike to work day, there are bike to work months, there's the national and the United Nations Bicycle Day. So these are all events that try to get people to ride bikes and then keep riding because they have a good experience. Of course, this also exists as bike to school days to get children to ride their bikes to school. In many schools in Europe, children get bike training in school as part of the school curriculum. In the US, some schools do it on a voluntary basis. Washington, D.C. requires it in 2nd grade, but voluntary bike training for kids is much more common here. And of course, in countries where you have many adults who have not ridden bikes for a long time it's important to offer bike training for adults. They may want to ride again, but they are not fully sure how to ride. They may not feel secure on a bike. So bike training for adults is very important. And then, of course, training motorists on how to obey traffic rules and how to yield to and know the rules when it comes to pedestrians and cyclists is very important. In many European countries, it's a big part of the driver education. So when you get your driver's license, you learn the rules of the road for cyclists and pedestrians and how to yield to them, how to drive defensively and watch out for them. And then last, many cities have taken to do so-called bicycle accounts following the city of Copenhagen. This can be an annual, biannual report where you track all things bikeway infrastructure extent, cyclist safety. In Copenhagen, they are combining it with a survey. So they're asking the public and they're asking cyclists questions about how comfortable they feel cycling, how satisfied they are with bike infrastructure, etc. And then they partly use the answers to these surveys to make policy. They may say, we want to have a 4.5 out of 5 in satisfaction with cycling infrastructure. And they make this a policy goal to work and achieve.
Yeah, one point is I would say that I like the strategy in Greater Vancouver of go by bike because it includes all these different purposes. Well, you know, planning professionals, engineering professionals, academics can have the best ideas in the world, but if you can't implement them through politics and policies, then they're useless. So implementation is absolutely crucial. And we have the second half, the last half of the final chapter in the book devoted exclusively to implementation. How do you get these things implemented? Well, it's really important to let people know, to publicize the individual as well as the societal benefits of cycling, include citizen participation at all stages so people don't feel left out, that they don't feel like decisions are being made that are not in their interests or not what they want. If there are controversial policies, implement them in stages, such as you saw earlier. And that's especially in the case of the COVID. You saw that on Boylston Street in Boston, how they did this in stages, and also there on Beach Avenue there in Vancouver. I thought that was a great idea. You start out with something temporary, and then you make it permanent. You need bike plans, both long range and short range as well, which you can update regularly. Then I think it's really important, great to make cycling convenient and safe and so forth, but I think you also need to combine that with disincentives for car use. Lower car speeds more than anything else, reduce the amount of car parking, and just may even make cars almost off limits at certain times of day, car-free zones and so forth. And to get these things implemented, you might not like politicians, but without politicians, these things just don't get implemented. And you need public support as well. And that means media support. So through the media, through politicians, through public support, that's really crucial. And that means making alliances with environmental groups, with all sorts of groups who are in favor of sustainable cities in every respect, also health experts, and then benchmarking success over time to show that these strategies work and that we're making progress. Well, I'll be real. This is the last slide. I promise. We've sort of shown more pictures about bicycling infrastructure because it's just easier to take a picture of bicycling infrastructure than of a bike to work day or go by bike program. But that's necessary, but it's not sufficient. I do think that safe cycling infrastructure, good, convenient, low stress is absolutely crucial, especially on arterials, but it's not enough. You really do have to combine it with all those complementary programs, policies that Ralph showed in the earlier slides and that I mentioned also in terms of traffic calming. The last point I want to make, because we really did emphasize social justice, not only in that chapter, but throughout every chapter of the book, the importance of equity and social justice in every aspect of cycling. That means infrastructure that is convenient and seems safe and low stress for everybody so that all groups in society can cycle. And also in the planning process itself, I think especially for marginalized communities, for lower income communities, for communities of color, there's been a lot of controversy because they haven't been included in the planning process. And it's really crucial that all groups be included in that planning process. So that's it for our presentation. And if you'd like to have more details, you can buy the book And I've already seen some of these questions in the chat box, but we'll let our moderator choose which questions we should answer.
Yes, lots of questions. And if we don't get to all of them, John and Ralph have agreed to review the questions afterwards, and we'll include any answers that they have in the follow-up email. So thank you both for that incredibly interesting presentation. And you've definitely given us a lot to think about, some really successful and maybe some not so successful examples of what cities around the world have done in terms of promoting cycling infrastructure and getting more people on bikes. And I know that there's a lot of policymakers and cycling advocates on this call, so hopefully your lessons will be carried forward into practice in Metro Vancouver and from wherever else people are listening in on. So yes, the audience has raised a number of questions. Some are kind of similarly related, so I'll try to kind of group them. We've had 3 questions on cycling fatalities, and Gavin particularly wants to know if in European cities with increased cycling infrastructure, do you know to what extent the drop in fatality rates that you showed related to decreases in motor vehicle usage?
Ralph? Oh, you're on mute. Well, I don't think anyone can prove that. I mean,
Yeah.
You can look at a particular installation of a new cycling facility, and you can say, well, in that corridor, cycling became safer. There were fewer fatalities. You'll see more cycling in that. Let's say for example, in London or Paris or New York, there have been studies on particular cycling facilities, for example, in New York City, and they have a before and after comparison. And in almost every single case, I don't know of a single case where the fatality rate has increased. That is, you'll see a big increase in cycling. And even if there is any increase in cycling, that it's much less than the percentage increase in cycling volumes. Ralph?
I think part of the question was also related to motorized traffic volume. And the safety expert who wrote the chapter of our book, Rune Elvik, who's from Norway, he emphasized exactly that point. He said, when you want to look at the safety of cyclists, you always have to also include the exposure level in terms of not just cycling level, but also the level of motorized traffic. And as motorized traffic decreases, the exposure to the threat of motorized vehicles decreases as well, and helps improve the safety of cycling.
And that's also one of those reasons that's been given in various studies for the increase in cyclist injuries and fatalities in the United States over the last period, because the increase in vehicle miles traveled.
Okay, thank you for that. One of the things that I found most interesting about your presentation and then also your book is your focus on other countries. A lot of studies are really Eurocentric and focused on North America, but I enjoyed the chapters on Latin America especially. Joanna from the Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure here wants to know if you could speak to the urban-rural split in areas other than in India. She says it's interesting that rural mode share is higher than in India in urban areas. So it sounds like that's more due to income limitations. Is that something that you'd be able to answer?
Can I say just one thing about India, because I saw that in the chat box. I wanted to respond to it a little bit, and that is, it's a slight difference in India. I think it's like 18% bike share in urban areas. It's 22% in rural areas, meaning villages and so forth. And then someone else by city size, that is within urban areas, is there a difference? And it depends. It's roughly 20% for all city size categories. There's a table in the book. It shows this for like 6 city size categories, from 100,000 all the way up to about 2 million in size. There's like 4 categories, and they all have just about 20% of trips by bike. But then when you get to the really big cities, it was like over 5 million, all of a sudden the share goes down to like 8 or 9%. So there is that difference between city size. In terms of rural areas in China, in terms of rural areas, and someone asked about, there's no national travel survey in China at all. So all of the surveys are only conducted at the city level, and only bigger cities can afford to do a travel survey. So there's almost no information on cycling in rural areas. But what my Chinese colleagues told me, that I have 3 co-authors, and they said their impression, even without firm data, was that cycling level in rural areas was much lower, and then instead in rural areas, you'd have more use of motorbikes, mopeds, motorcycles, and so forth. In Germany, well, Ralph, rather than speak to just you, tell about the situation in, say, Austria, Germany, and so forth.
Yeah, that's what I thought of. We did a study on large cities in Germany, Austria, and Switzerland, where we looked at the variation of cycling levels in the city center, the city, the suburbs, and then the outer suburbs. And what we found was that in the inner suburbs, the cycling levels sort of dropped, but then in the outer suburbs, suddenly cycling levels were higher again than they were in the inner suburbs. So there was quite a sizable share of trips made by bike in these more rural areas. And one explanation for that is that the settlements there are relatively compact still, and you are able to reach destinations you have to go to. So they may have, in contrast to many places here in the US, they may have a supermarket you could actually cycle to, or they may have some sort of a town center where you can get ice cream or whatever you can do there, but the trip distances are still short enough that in these towns that often have very poor public transport, you can use your bike to get around and get to places. So it's not at the scale of India, what we saw, but we saw that also in wealthy Western European countries, that in the outer suburban areas towards rural areas, we had higher cycling levels again.
And this points out something, a point we failed to include on one of the slides, and that is land use and urban development policies. And they're very, very strict. If you go to the Netherlands, Germany, Austria, Switzerland, it's not that people might not want to have sprawl, but it's just, you can't do it. I mean, it's very, very difficult to have the kind of sprawl development that we have in North America. And that means trip distances are shorter. And as Ralph said, even in small settlements, you have the settlement, and then you have it surrounded by agriculture. You have relatively short distances and much lower speed limits too.
Interesting. I imagine that cycling highways in those countries are also facilitating people going to the suburbs. I know that's something we're pushing for at Hub, but there's still a long way to go in North America to kind of build those cycling highways that you were talking about.
There's been a big trend toward these cycling superhighways in Germany, Netherlands, Belgium, and so forth.
Another question is about weather and topography, and if any of your research looked at those factors and how that impacted cycling. As somebody who lives in Vancouver, I think it's all about the weather, but and dressing for the weather, but maybe you can speak a bit more to that, and maybe if e-bikes or the transition towards e-bikes and those types of devices will level out cycling across the board, even if you live in a hilly terrain.
Well, I'll tell you what, I'll let Ralph deal with the terrain and I'll talk about the weather since we've got a thunderstorm right now in North Carolina. Anyway, and that is, when you look at the weather and then can look at the results of the levels of cycling in different countries and different cities, and you wonder, wow, how can that be? So look at, say, Montreal. It's not exactly a warm winter that people have there in Montreal or in Calgary or Quebec City. They're very, very cold. Or look at Stockholm. Or I don't think that having a very severe winter necessarily prevents cycling, at least over much of the year. And what about rain? You do get, I mean, the Portland, Seattle, and Vancouver have among the highest cycling rates in all of North America, and yet they're very rainy, well, maritime climates. Very wonderful, very green maritime climates, but you wouldn't say it's like perfectly sunny all the time. And the weird thing is the Netherlands also has a maritime climate. And so the northwestern part of Germany, where I was, 40% of all trips by bike. It's amazing how cities and countries with lousy climates can have very high levels of cycling. Switzerland, by the way, is not a flat country, talking about topography, and yet it has a very high level of cycling. But I'll let Ralph get to the topography question.
Yeah, so topography definitely matters. If you have very hilly terrain, certain people will not ride a bike. But as flat terrain does not guarantee high levels of cycling, topography does not guarantee that there is no cycling or there are low levels of cycling. So there are many other moderating factors in getting people to ride bikes. I agree that the e-bikes can be a great help in sort of leveling out the topography, because you can now ride a bike and with relatively little physical exertion, with the help of the electric motor, you can get up these hills. For example, the German city of Stuttgart is sort of in, I don't even know what the English word for it is. It's sort of like in a valley. There's hills all around, and they're working with a German battery manufacturer to have e-bike sharing there to get people up those hills. So e-bikes can be a big help. Another element that can hinder bicycling are cities, and John mentioned Stockholm, that have many islands or that have port areas, because there you need bridges. You need these connections to get across the bodies of water, and that's often where cars and bicycles and everyone sort of congregates to get across. So you have to make special provisions there to have either separate bike bridges or to have accommodations for bicyclists on the bridges that you have for motorized traffic.
Thanks for that. We're going to just take maybe 2 more questions just so that we don't go past 1:30. But Joe wants to know, why is London more like the US than Europe in the statistics, and often more closer? And it seems to be kind of consistent across the data. Do you think that's a cultural factor, or is there some sort of other explanation?
It's a really good question, and I wish my British colleague, John Parkin, were here to answer it. I really can't answer that question. I'm not really sure. It might be partly cultural. One thing that did happen is, if you go back to say 1955, 60 or something, the UK had almost the same percentage of trips by bike as Germany does now. It's like 12% or something like that. And then all of a sudden there was this huge drop in the level of cycling in the UK, whereas Germany, as well as the Netherlands, managed to rebound from the decline in cycling. I don't really have a good answer as to why the UK is so low. I don't think it's they probably do have more sprawl. I think the land use controls in the UK are less strict than they are on the continent. I think that does play a role. There certainly is sprawl in British cities, so that might be one of the reasons. Ralph, do you have any ideas on that?
No, it's very difficult to explain it, because also in that John explained how the bike mode share was similar and then sort of diverged with continental Europe or with Germany, and this happened at a time when in Britain the motorization was lower than in Germany. The Germans owned more cars and drove more cars than the British do. One other explanation may be that in England walking shares are higher than in German cities, so there's more walking for shorter distances. And in some cities, especially London, public transport is quite good in England, but there's no really strong marker or strong explanation that I can think of that shows why there's difference, especially when you think about the divergence after the Second World War.
Okay, thanks. Another question is about kind of the minor cycling infrastructure that cities or towns put up in order to kind of placate cyclists, like the share the road signs and the sharrows, but it's not what something like hub cycling infrastructure, as hub cycling would consider proper cycling infrastructure. Do those have any positive effect, or are they just more band-aid solutions, and is that better than nothing, or do you have any studies that show that it does actually improve safety to some degree?
I think the real answer to that is, are the laws enforced? And unfortunately, at least in the United States, in most of the United States, traffic laws intended to protect pedestrians as well as cyclists are simply not enforced. And so we have a number of sharrowed streets here in Raleigh, North Carolina, which is, it's not a small place. We have like 2 million people in the metropolitan area. And it's like no one seems to understand what a sharrow means. The cyclists don't really understand it. The motorists certainly don't understand it. And they don't yield to cyclists anyway here in North Carolina. So it's a problem. Just putting up a sign or putting a marker on the road, I think it's less effective here. In Germany, in the Netherlands, in Denmark, those traffic laws protecting cyclists are much, much more strictly enforced. And that means they're taken seriously. They're taught in the school system, and also for motorist training. So I think these signs are much more likely to have an impact in those countries and those cultures where you have laws to protect cyclists and give them, I put a priority over motorized traffic because they're more vulnerable in traffic crashes. Ralph?
Yeah, and I think on top of that, many of these applications, you mentioned sharrows, but also bike lanes are put on the wrong kinds of roadways. So you have bike lanes on roadways here in the US, and sometimes sharrows where the speed is way too high, where the car traffic volume is way too high, and you should not have these facilities. You should really have a protected bike lane in those locations. So sharrows can work if they are used in a right space. But in many spaces where they are put, they're more like a good luck charm, sending you out and having you ride in a space where you shouldn't ride. But the political question, or political part of your question is it better than nothing? And I still don't agree with the high volume and high speed situations, but often it's better than nothing to start stitching together a bikeway network. You may be able to have the political support to put in bike lanes or protected bike lanes in certain areas, but not in others yet. And if you connect these with a sharrow for the time being, it's probably better than nothing, because it will help getting more people on bikes and build political support over time. And then you may be able to put in a bike lane or protected bike lane. So I think they're better than nothing if they are put in the right location. If they are putting people into harm's way, then they're not better than nothing.
I think having that symbol of the bicycle on the pavement, it somehow says bikes belong here. It's okay. They belong. They're welcome here, and so forth. But I just do think we have to do a better job of education of motorists in particular.
Okay, thanks both. And just one final question about driver training. Have you seen any comparative studies into motor vehicle driver training curriculums that cover cyclists and pedestrian awareness that have been done really well? Besides the ones that you mentioned in Europe, is there something that you've kind of seen that stands out that you would wish would be more widely spread? I remember in one of your last webinars that I attended, there was a gentleman in the UK, and he suggested that they had truck drivers who were forced to get on bicycles. Is there something similar to that you could display or explain?
I mean, I think there are a couple of issues here with the trainings. I'm not aware of any good international comparative studies that compare driver training in country A to country B. There are some European reports that compare the standards in the European countries and driving age and the probation age and things like that. I'm aware of one study, and I think it was a master's thesis by a student, who compared the children's training in Germany, the Netherlands, and some programs here in the US. But I'm not aware of this sort of great, big, robust study that you talked about. I'm aware of some programs here in the US. I think the city of Minneapolis was one of them. I forget others, where they have their city engineers ride bikes once a year, so that when they are engineering a street, that they know what it feels like from the perspective of a cyclist, to put themselves into the cyclist's shoes when they are thinking about roads and are designing roads. But I haven't seen any specific evaluation of it. What I hear is planners say, this really worked. This really helped engineers understand the needs of cyclists. But I haven't seen any robust analyses that compare city A where they do it and city B where they don't do it, and then have some sort of statistical analysis.
There are specific cities. I'm not sure if it's Chicago, but there are a number of cities that actually do have special bus driver training for those bus lines where there are bike lanes and so forth, to make sure that they are aware of how to not endanger cyclists. So, I mean, I think there's probably a lot of cities with specific programs like that, whether it's training of taxi drivers, training of bus drivers, and so forth. There was Ralph. Remember one of the webinars we gave? There was someone who mentioned that that they require now these cameras on trucks. The larger vehicles, as I mentioned earlier, are much more dangerous for cyclists. if there's a crash than other vehicles. I mean, more likely to get into a crash, but also more serious injury or death. And one of the people who was attending the webinar said, and what was it? What country was it, Ralph? Can you remember?
I think it was the UK and then also Germany. We had a discussion among them. It was about this detection for cyclists that are next to a truck, because they can be sort of in a blind spot, and sort of that the vehicle itself alerts the driver to the presence of a cyclist. And in, I think it was the UK. I think
it was great. It was Greater London. It was Greater London, and the person who's the executive director of the London Cycling Campaign, which is sort of like Hub in London, said that they had gotten through a law that requires trucks to be equipped with these special cameras to detect a bicyclist in the blind spots. I think that's what it was. So that's a pretty innovative program right there.
Yeah, for certain. Well, I think that's all the time we have. Unfortunately, I know that there's lots of questions we didn't get to, but we will record this webinar, and I'll make sure to send some of these extra questions on to John and Ralph, and if they have time, they will answer them, and you'll get these all in a follow-up email. Before we finish here, we would just really like to extend a big thank you to both of you, to John and Ralph, for participating today and for providing us with sorry, such an enlightened presentation. Excuse me. And also to the Hub, thank you to the Hub web members who made this webinar possible, and to all our Go by Bike Week sponsors and supporters. And if you'd like more ways to join Hub as a member for as little as $15 a year, you can join at bikehub.ca/join. Also make sure to check out all our cycling education courses, volunteer at a Hub local committee in your neighborhood, and check out the other events, both online and in person, that are happening the rest of this week and then on for the rest of the year. And just a reminder that our Go by Bike Week runs until Sunday, June 6th. So remember to log your trips. We have lots of great prizes, and make sure to check out the online event schedule. And with that, John and Ralph, thanks again. We are at the end of our webinar. Our facilitators will leave the meeting open for a few minutes if you just want to leave a comment in the chat. Thank you again so much, both of you, for spending the extra time with us and adding on that question and answer session, which I know is invaluable. And thank you also to our participants, for so many of you staying on the call till the bitter end. And yeah, thanks again. And any information about Hub, you can just go to bikehub.ca.
Yeah, I would like to apologize that we went over. I'm very sorry about that. We had to end up to wrap up sooner.
We had more than half the people stayed on till the end. So, and for those that didn't, they'll get a follow up. They can watch this later.
Okay.
But thanks so much.
And you'll share with them our email addresses so they can email questions.
If that's okay with both of you, then that's fine.
However you want to do it is fine.
Okay, great. Thank you. You're welcome to sign off now, and
thank you very much for having us.
So much.
Yeah.
Did you hear the rain pouring on my?
No, but I'm glad the thunderstorm held off.
It's still raining, but it's at least not bad. Yeah. Thank you very much, Kathy. I appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. And if you're ever in Vancouver, I hope to see you in person at some point.
Oh, I love Vancouver. I've been there 5 or 6 times, and I see a lot of sun there too. It doesn't just rain.
Yeah, it's been very hot. We've had over 80 degrees Fahrenheit here the last week. So,
wow.
But the rain is coming tomorrow, so we're not getting too excited.
We've got that right now.
All right, okay. Bye. Thank you, everybody, for listening in.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.